Hey, there we go. That's good. All right. Recording in progress. I have to say yes over here. Got it. Okay. So last week we spent some time talking about Paul Tillich and specifically the dynamics of faith and the ultimate concern. And John Mark did a really great job giving us sort of like a breakdown of that kind of understanding. And Paul Tillich, just for a refresher, was a theologian in the early 19th century, German, definitely speaking into a very particular context. He is of the same age as like Karl Barth and Rudolf Bultmann, and he's in that core group of theologians who are addressing the situation in Germany from World War I, so 1914 and 1918, and then into the rise and fall of the Weimar Republic, which ends with Hitler taking over and the establishment of the Third Reich. And then we have the 30s, by the mid-30s, Hitler's in power, and then you have the 30s into the mid-40s, and that's when finally the opposing powers eventually break through and start shutting stuff down. But these theologians are really fascinating to read because they're speaking to a very specific context. So what John Mark highlighted for us was, you know, when you go through something like World War II, and a lot of us are probably facing it now, about 18 months into a pandemic, what does it mean to have faith? Where is God in a situation where there's chaos seems to be reigning? Why should I still be Christian? I had faith and yet God let someone close to me die from COVID. You know, like we are currently facing such a unique time that the theologians who are writing right now are writing to a specific context, asking the question, what does it mean to be a part of a religion, specifically mine? And what does it mean to be Jewish or Muslim or, you know, Hindu? And how can these religions address certain things? And John Mark did a really great job talking about the ultimate concern and that what we place in that spot becomes definitive for all things. So if we, and we'll get to this at some point, but there's a thing called civil religion. And civil religion is where the sacred, or I don't really like using these terms, but where the sacred and the secular merge into one, and then something like the combination of religious sentiment and nationalism or patriotism. Okay, so we could maybe even call out from our context the Pledge of Allegiance. It's a really interesting little statement if you think about each of those lines. You know, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, under God. One, you know, like that under God thing is really interesting because you're pledging to a flag and you're linking it to God. That's sort of a civil religion thing. And then another thing would be where religious people, so people like me, the kind of clerics, start showing up and pulling in the state symbols into our worship, or maybe pulling worship into state symbols, okay? And we start to make things like religious holidays that are actually state holidays. Okay, and so civil religion is a really interesting thing, but it's something that isn't new. But Tillich was definitely talking into that. Ultimate concern addresses that. So if the nation becomes your ultimate concern, you will put that idea into the spot of God, and then you will start defining your ideologies and your activities, your what I like to call your praxis, your actions will start aligning in a religious way towards this ultimate concern, and you will lash out at any time you feel that that ultimate concern is threatened, or the fulfillment, the ultimate promise and the ultimate fulfillment is being threatened. You'll lash out. And so that sort of helps us to kind of navigate our own terrain when we see such vitriolic language and activity between political parties. You know, it's all about that definition of what that ultimate concern is. Now, ultimately, I would say that Tillich, I would agree with this, and I think anyone else who's devoted to a particular tradition that looks at something that I called a long time ago the numinous. But if your ultimate concern becomes the numinous, and the numinous of your tradition has an ultimate concern, then that should be your ultimate concern as well. So in Christianity, I ended with last time talking about how for us, when we look at, for Christians, when we look at God through the lenses that we have as Christians, specifically Jesus Christ, we know that God's ultimate concern is us. Okay. And so as God is our ultimate concern, that means our neighbor becomes also part of that ultimate concern. And therefore everything that we do and all the ideologies that we ascribe to and the dogmas we create should reflect that ultimate concern. Okay. And so you can, I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing, but anyway, we were building off of that because the ultimate concern is deeply linked to another thing I've been hammering home, which is the pre-understanding. Does anyone want to define pre-understanding?
It is simply coming to the table with previous experiences and beliefs. Yeah,
that's a really great way of defining it, David. Thank you. It's really just everything that you've been sort of taught and you've picked up along the way. And I kind of think that because I don't really believe that babies are born in the state of like blank slates or tabula rasa. If you want to sound really fancy at a dinner party, just drop tabula rasa. It will make everyone stop talking to you. These are introvert tricks. Start speaking another language. That blank slate, that tabula rasa, I think that we come in with our we have a genetic code that's already predetermined in terms of who we've been born to, right? Like what the genetic code is that makes us, that comes from two people. And I think that we're sort of born with our little quirks and mannerisms, otherwise all babies would be the same. And I know that there are some babies that don't scream for 6 months straight because people have told me about them. So obviously each baby, I'm throwing shade on all three of my children right now. But they're all unique, right? Like any of us who had more than one kid would know that you don't parent each kid identically, right? Because they're all so different. So, we come into the world with probably a kind of orientation in a lot of different ways. And so our pre-understanding, it just encapsulates our upbringing, our teaching, the school we went to, the college we went to, our gender, the sex we're assigned at birth, like all of that starts to influence. So my experience as a priest is going to be a lot different than a man's experience as a priest, right? So we have all these pre-understandings, and the goal is in religion is to allow those pre-understandings to perpetually come into encounter with new information. Okay. And when we encounter new information, that's the crisis, right? That's the moment where we have to either say, we're staying this course and I'm not accepting the new information, or it's where we accept the new information without challenging it. And then a third option would be to wrestle with the new information and see how it folds into who you are and how it reforms you. And so that's pre-understanding. And then ultimate concern, this idea of our religion and faith and how these things come into contact. And then what we do when we leave this room, okay? Or this room, this one. There it is. I got it. This one. So we want to be able to engage with others from other traditions without having to make them like us, okay, adopt them into our pre-understandings, and allow them space to tell us who they are. So what I said at one point was we want to be able to ask the question and have the patience to listen for the answer. Okay, and a lot of that is being aware that you have a bunch of pre-understandings, and some of them are going to be affirmed and some of them are going to be challenged, and it might be uncomfortable, but that's okay. Letting others define themselves allows you to know what their pre-understandings are. And then specifically in regards to religion, allowing yourself to hear what others perceive as what your religion's about. And for Christians, I think that's a great place to be right now, honestly. It tells us a lot. As I've said, you want to listen to the people who are outside the church that are talking about your foundation, because if you're inside the church, you may not know that part of it's fracturing. Okay. And so because Christianity has participated in some pretty strong nationalistic and colonist type activity, it might be good for us to take a back seat a little bit and listen to see how other people are defining us. So not being the initiators, but necessarily the receivers. But anyway, that's just sort of a review of what we've kind of been talking about. Is there anything I'm missing or anything in that provoked more question? I'll take silence. I'll fill it. Former high school teacher. I know how to fill the silence. Okay, so what I wanted to do today is I wanted to start with, I'm excited. You may not be excited, but I'm excited. I altered this plan because of a conversation I was having with some other people. But first, what I want to do is I am going to find a document and then I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to start with a quote from that article that I gave to everyone in the class. And we're going to look at a short little passage, but I want to find it and share my screen. And then that should be enough. And then we'll jump from there into my lecture, and then we'll do something fun after the break. Teachings. Spiritual University. And wait, let's do this. Excellent. I'm going to pull up PowerPoint instead of Word. Oh, I'm fancy. Okay. Share screen. PowerPoint. Share. All right. Let me move this and make it bigger. All right. And then can you see that? Okay. I am just going to move you guys over. Well, I'm just going to, while you're looking at it, I am going to read the portion. But if you want to go ahead and start reading while I flip to it over here. Okay. This is near the end. Okay. And this kind of starts to pick up on what we're going to be talking about shortly. Now, brotherhood and sisterhood are positive human attitudes. It is good to be brothers. I would be the last person to negate the virtue of such an attitude. And in fact, in Islam, the devout call each other brothers and sisters. Yet that feeling of brotherhood is certainly not going to solve the problem of the plurality of religions, because it leaves aside the basic question of religious truth, which is related to knowledge rather than sentiment. Nevertheless, this school did play a considerable role upon the religion scene for a long time, to the extent that most scholars of comparative religion finally reacted against it by saying, please do not talk about religions being the same. In fact, they are not at all the same, and in most cases, they have nothing to do with each other. Their reaction went to the opposite extreme, and the type of treatment of comparative religion popular in the 30s and 40s, which had been penetrated into scholarly circles and the academic world, was brushed aside. Okay, and we're actually going to be looking at today intolerance and tolerance and brotherhood and sisterhood, because the thing that Nasser's getting at in this quote is that there are overlaps, and we are, through our human identity, brothers and sisters. But as we progress in our specific and particular traditions and religions, we take on different ideologies and ideas and habits and practices, right? So like soups. Soup is, if you break down the idea of soup, it seems like all soups are the same. But yet, depending on what you're throwing into that broth initially, and then what you finish it off with, soups become radically different. Okay, I received a soup 2 weeks ago from Susan, and it was delicious, and it was wonderful, and I loved it, and I ate it up like multiple times. And then I sent another soup over recently. Susan, was that soup the same? No, it was totally different.
By the way, it was phenomenally excellent. And we had a little bit tonight for dinner again. But yeah, nowhere near the same name, soup, but
yeah, nowhere near the same. And literally, like if you break down like what you do, it's almost like even the activity is a little bit the same, but soup takes on this, and that's how I kind of see us as like chunks of carrots and potatoes and bone and meat and like kind of all simmering in the same broth. And we're all going to have, as Christians that go to this particular church, we're going to have similar flavor. Okay. But if we just go down the road to like St. Matt's, it's going to have its own variety, but yet it's going to be similar because of the Christian and the Episcopalian aspect. Branching out when we get into other territories and different cultures and different religions, it's going to taste different. But even though the component parts seem so similar, right? Anyway, that idea just came to me, and of course I just got a little bit excited about it. I'm also hungry. So anyway, when we look at this, but what Nasser is calling out is this tendency to want to throw out the idea of any overlap because we're so different. I get that. I really understand that sentiment. But the thing is that both views are right. That's the paradox of talking about religion. Both views. We are both brothers and sisters, and then not at all. Okay? And that paradox, that collision of that yes and no, or the yes in the no, or the no in the yes, that paradox of the similarity and difference is where I think religion really kind of comes alive, and talking about it becomes really, really fun. Are you okay if I stop sharing the screen? Or does anyone have anything to say about this particular quote?
Yeah, Brian has a question.
What's religious truth?
Because it's right here in the, it leaves aside the basic question of religious truth.
I'm looking for it. Why am I not finding it?
The feeling of brotherhood and sisterhood is certainly not going to solve the problem of the plurality of religions.
Okay.
Because
Okay, because it leaves aside the basic question of religious truth, which is related to knowledge rather than sentiment. Okay. So the idea that, all right, so I was a kid, but remember, we are the world.
Mm-hmm.
We are the world. We are the people, right?
Right.
Beautiful sentiment. But what happened is that it tried to kind of merge everyone into this like one like human conglomerate blob. And then that became the justification for why we should love each other, right? Like, we're the world, we are the people, we're all the same. And then they had that beautiful, very diverse group of people singing, and it was all happy, but it was a sentiment. There wasn't anything that was related to specifically knowledge. And so what Nasser wants to do is he's grounding religion as a thing. It's not just a sentiment. It's not, you don't want to say, remember way back when we talked about, you don't want to say God is one, because without fail, you will take all other traditions and submit them to your pre-understanding that is from your soup broth, okay? The specific way that you're made. You'll push everything under that idea that God looks like the God, for me, looks like the God of, the parent of Jesus Christ, okay? So, but that's not fair, because not all other traditions, one, have a God, and then secondly, not all other traditions see God as someone who can transcend God's self and become human, and it's kind of gets really messy. So what Nasser wants to do is he wants to kind of throw out that idea that oh, we're just brothers and sisters and we're all just doing our, you know, kind of our own thing, but it's so similar. And he wants to address the idea that that just gets us as far as sentiment, warm feelings. Oh, we're brothers and sisters, rather than actually grounding religion in the material realm as a means by which we acquire knowledge about the world and go about our day. So I believe that what he's doing is that the truth of religion is kind of like saying, it's a messy word. I don't think I would have chosen it, but that idea of truth, he's linking into the kind of the experience, not just the sentiment, but the experience and the material. Like Christianity as a religion is a real thing that has an institution and it has clerics and it has rituals and practices. And those things aren't just like side notes. Those are primary notes alongside the brotherhood and the sisterhood. Does that make sense?
Lauren, the thing I'm having trouble with in that statement is linking it to knowledge.
Yeah.
And for me, the word that you used, experience, makes so much more sense. And the fact that religions have, you know, all the trappings, to me, is not the truth of the religion.
Right.
It's maybe part of the experience, but it doesn't go to the truth of religion. Religious truth.
Right. And that idea too of religious truth versus the truth of a religion, right? So like that, this reminds me, is anyone familiar with Friedrich Schleiermacher? Just kidding. I just wanted to say Schleiermacher. But he was writing, a German theologian that was writing in the 1800s, very influential in sort of the German Protestant cultural cultivation of the overlap of the two. Anyway, he makes a really beautiful defense of religion from the human perspective, that we aren't going to just get rid of religion because religion is something that has always been around and humans always participate in this thing called religion. But then you have specific religions that are tapping into religion, like that kind of eternal of religion, and they manifest themselves differently. Now, I actually have on my teaching, and this might be something we do next time, or maybe on the last day when we're just kind of like wrapping up, but I have a video from a friend that he talked about specifically that thinker's understanding of religion. And it's a short video, it's about 10 minutes. And I think it might be really beneficial to look at the idea of the truth of religion, or religious truth, and how it relates to a concept like experience and knowledge. And I agree, Cynthia, I think experience is a better word, but I do think that Nasser's own pre-understandings with his own traditions is where we start to see some of these words come up. There would be an emphasis on knowledge coming out of Islam, 100%. So this would be, that's interesting, yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because if you don't mind, if you're ready, I'll shut this screen share down and I'll pull up my teaching outline. Are you guys good with that? You guys look the same over there too, okay. All right, let me stop the share and then I'll find my outline. All right, here we go. So what I wanna do is pop over here, escape out of that. Let's just shut that down. I'm telling you everything I'm doing, total transparency over here. All right, now, let me just minimize this so I can see you. All right, so what I want to start with first, because I have a definite trajectory of the evening that I want to end on a very specific discussion. So what I'm looking at here, and I'm just going to minimize your screen a little bit. Those of you who are spying on me from behind can see that all right, here we go. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to talk about intolerance and tolerance first. Are you guys ready? Okay, this is all in line with that whole idea of we're intolerant of each other, that kind of the end of that quote where, You know, we're not the same at all. Okay, so tolerance is putting up with the views of others opposed to your own for the common good. Okay, so that's sort of a decent definition of what tolerance is. Okay, now that isn't necessarily acceptance. That isn't necessarily validation. That isn't necessarily rejection, right? It's just, oh, that's what you think. Okay. It's a pretty neutral word. To be tolerant is to be sort of okay with difference, but maybe you're not engaging it 100%. Maybe you're not adopting it into your own. You're just kind of like, that's what they think over there. I'm fine with that. You might harbor a little bit, just stay over there. Okay. Tolerance is an interesting word because I think we use it in place of acceptance, in place of belonging. Like, I'm very tolerant. Like, I could be tolerant while Liza is whining and whining and whining. It doesn't mean I like it or respect it or I don't want it to go away, right? Like, when you actually get into the idea of moving beyond diversity and moving beyond inclusion into belonging is when you start to get where you can be in the same space with someone who's completely different and you validate and hear them and accept their view as justified and part of their experience, and you want to understand it more. You know what I'm saying? Tolerance isn't that, but I think we use this word tolerance maybe too much. You know what I mean? So what I'm wondering is, where do we find, what are some areas where you are right now where you find that definition of tolerance, of putting up with something for the common good? Anyone who feels comfortable sharing can share. We have the holidays coming up, folks. I'm sure there's some ideas popping up now.
Well, I'll just jump in and say, putting up with really divergent political views, even though I get really distressed about sometimes the impact. But for the common good, we need to be able to hear these because there are people that are thinking and feeling what we're hearing. And so.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That is 100% true. That politics right now, that idea of tolerance is really profound because we kind of want to maybe quell the fires of that reactivity that seems to be so on the surface. And so being tolerant of people who have different political views might be as much as you can give, and that might be pretty good. Right? Rather than feeling like you have to convert them over to your side, or maybe you feel like you have to correct them, you can just say like, okay, that's what they believe. I'm going to take a deep breath. You know, that's tolerance. Anything else where you've experienced tolerance in regards to like not acceptance, but just tolerance?
I just want to say, with the holidays coming up, I was absolutely thinking about family members, and tolerance can be really hard when you don't get it in return.
Yes. Wow. Yes. Yep. 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 Yep.
Hard to tolerate someone when they're very intolerant. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yep. When tolerance collides with intolerance.
What about in the workplace? Like, if you're working with someone, I'm thinking of myself in a school setting with an administrator that I didn't like and didn't care to be around, but it wasn't about me and this other person getting along. It was about the good of the kids.
Yeah, right? Like, it's for the better. Like, when you put something else in front and you say, oh, I'm going to bear with this because ultimately it's the right thing to do because it's keeping everyone together, or it's this person is meeting the needs of the people, even if I have like other qualms with what's going on. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Tolerance is a really profound thing. And when it comes to religions, at different points of history, religions have had differing levels of toleration. Okay? So is Christianity a really tolerant religion?
Not really.
I'd say
No. It's got a colorful history with not being very tolerant. Even now, we probably know of people who have removed family members based off of sexual orientation or political orientation or whom they married, right? Like there is a lot of intolerance going on in Christianity. But then you can turn around and, I think of some of the, I think of our congregation here, because I'm kind of biased, but we're very inclusive and accepting, and so it's not, I never want to be like, well, not all churches, because we all participate in this sort of past. But Christianity can also be, I think, when looking through the lens of Jesus specifically and following in Jesus's footsteps, very tolerant, okay, or very accepting, going even beyond that. So one religion that I'm always very fascinated by is Hinduism, because Hinduism is very tolerant of other ideas in general. Now, there is a militant faction to Hinduism, specifically coming in that warrior level of the caste system. But with Hinduism, they are often eager to pick up things they like from other traditions. So and this may be unfair, but I compare it to tofu. Like throwing tofu in tomato soup is going to be still tofu with some, Marty doesn't like this idea. Okay, throwing tofu in a stir fry, or maybe you don't like tofu. Oh, I love it. Okay, so if you put tofu in something, it acquires the flavor, but it still remains its substance, but it acquires the flavor of something else. When you study the history of Hinduism, you get a variety of different Hinduisms, in that when another tradition hits up against it, Hinduism goes, oh, well, thank you for that extra flavor. We'll go ahead and take it in. And you have these sections of Hinduism. My favorite is Theistic Hinduism, where this becomes they acquired the grace concept from Christianity. This is why Gandhi often sounds very Christian in some of his understandings, because he's part of that theistic Hinduism, and it's got components of grace. It's got an understanding that you can pick a divinity in the multiple, okay, there's anywhere from like 60 to like hundreds. You can pick one and it can mediate for you. That's Christianity, right? Like, but when Hinduism bumps up against something, it's just like, oh, sure, we can bring this in. Buddhism as well is generally tolerant. But then some Buddhist governments, like one in Myanmar, can be oppressive to tribal religions. Okay, so you can see how different traditions have been more tolerant and accepting even of different traditions, and how some haven't been. With the monotheistic traditions, it gets really interesting, because oftentimes with that ideology and that dogmatic orientation that you have to worship this one God, we will, for fear of being a heretic or for fear of falling outside of the good graces of this one God, we will reject all other traditions and strongly downplay the idea of pluralism. But when push comes to shove, I bet most of us are some form of Christian pluralist, right? Because some of us are reading philosophy, and some of us are reading about Buddhism, and some of us are reading about Confucianism. And I always say, I'm like a Confucian Christian, because I love Confucius and think he got so much right, and like to add in that practice into my own daily living, the Confucian way of living and transforming and all that ideas. But we don't allow any other gods to come in, and we don't allow any other religious practices to come in. So if I wanted to start talking about that I am also worshiping another God alongside the God of Jesus Christ, there would be a problem like on a diocesan level. Okay, because we have a very specific code. All right. Though we could argue if we wanted to have some fun, the Trinity is a little pluralistic. But anyway, no, they're no one substance. You know, it's a paradox. But anyway, so we have religions where that show a little bit stronger intolerance. Monotheistic traditions tend to. And we have some traditions that show a little bit more tolerance, and that's sort of the polytheistic or the atheistic religions that don't necessarily have a God that's like threatening, you know, condemnation. And I mentioned pluralism, and pluralism, to give you a definition of that, is the recognition of religious differences and the effort to deal with them constructively by pulling them alongside each other. Okay? Pluralism acknowledges religions are different, and instead of just putting up with them, tolerance seeks to work together for the larger goal. So pluralism would be like, as I said, bringing the work of Confucius alongside the work of Jesus and what Jesus did for us on the cross. Because sometimes I feel that Christianity is lacking in a very clear worldly praxis in what we're supposed to do. And I feel that Confucius actually offers me in the Analects a really good way of navigating the world from my religious convictions of having faith in Jesus and being led by the Spirit. Okay, so that's that with pluralist, you know, you can kind of bring these things in, and it's not just tolerant, but it's actually allowing another tradition to give you another view on life and accepting that. Buddhism has a high regard for all life. Okay, and we Christians could really learn a lot from that Buddhist principle, that moral value on all life matters, in terms of not degrading Black Lives Matter, but I mean like the gnat. Like the gnat matters. And if you intentionally go to kill that mosquito, that's cruel. Because that's a life. Okay, we could use a little bit more value on that totality of life mattering, from the tree to the gnat to the elephant to the human being, right? So there's ways that other traditions can definitely kind of influence us in a pluralist way. That doesn't necessarily mean that we now have to go around pointing the finger and calling everyone a heretic. That's the risk, because we're a monotheistic tradition. And so we always have to safeguard against this idea of worshiping multiple gods. Even though we can say that maybe there are a bunch of gods out there. It doesn't, we come from the line of this one God has been the God of this people, and we are in that line. But anyway, that's maybe a discussion for another time. But so that's pluralism, and it's different than tolerance, because you're actually adopting something into you're changing the flavor of your soup. Okay, and this is the neat thing about having a congregation, because even though we're all sort of bubbling away in this specific thing, we're all kind of now in bowls, right? So what we put into that bowl of soup, the soup might be identical to bowl to bowl to bowl, but once we start putting in Tabasco or sriracha or some extra salt or a little bit more pepper, then those bowls start to change flavors, right? So that's sort of like a congregation. Wow, I'm really pushing this soup thing far. Okay. The big question is, what is the limit of tolerance, and should there be limits to tolerance? Can a religion ever become fully tolerant? Could secularism or atheism ever become fully tolerant? What factors do we need to realize when we think of tolerance? So those are the questions that we kind of need to sit with. What does it mean to be tolerant, and are there limits to tolerance? And then specifically, what does your tradition say about the limits of tolerance? And then how do you adjust in that framework? Okay. I'm not going to answer those questions. I want you to think about them as you think about the idea of tolerance, and broaden that to broaden that to the idea of diversity, inclusion, and belonging. I think with our human brains, we have a hard time thinking of belonging while incorporating profound difference. I think when we think of belonging, we want to think about my little in-group where we all get along and we think the same. But I'm not sure that's actually belonging, as it is just, well, we're all sharing in pre-understandings that are similar. But anyway, think about what the limits are on some of these ideas and concepts. And maybe there aren't limits. Maybe we're still working with an old paradigm that tells us we need to have limits on these things. Okay? So just allow those questions to be a challenge. So when we move into any questions on tolerance and pluralism and intolerance and whatever. Yes.
Yep. So I'll ask another question, maybe to include, should we tolerate intolerance?
Oh, that is an excellent question. That is an excellent question. It is such a good question that I am literally going to leave you guys with it. I mean, but it's true, because this is such a profound question, because it's what we wrestle with this idea when we talk about love, right? Like, to what extent do I allow someone to, I was just talking about this with someone. To what extent do I allow someone to remain in my, I just got a new tattoo, and I was talking with my artist, and we were talking about this very thing, and he said, you know, like, I will go to the extent that I need to go to for my kids, but what happens, but there is that thing, if they become a threat to everyone else in the house, I will have to ask them to leave. And I think that we really wrestle with that idea of that, how far do we tolerate, and does it include intolerance? And then what does that mean? And sometimes the onus always falls on the tolerant person to be the graceful one. And the intolerant person tends to be able to do whatever they want. That's kind of my experience, but it's a really profound question because it has ramifications all the way down. And my knee-jerk reaction is to say it's case by case. It depends on what the intolerance is. It depends on where it is. It depends on who it's harming immediately. It depends if that person is someone I know. It depends on, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's so many factors that come into answering that question that it really is unique to each of you, because we all have different thresholds, right? Anyone want to add anything to that? Marty?
Kind of. I'm wondering where the line or definitional difference is between tolerance and acceptance.
Yes, excellent question. Tolerance is always like, you can be in the same room, but you're not sitting next to each other. And I think acceptance would move those two people closer together. Like, I love this person. We see things really differently, you know. Maybe I could say this about my brother, like, we are very different. I love him and I accept him, but we don't see things very similarly, and we've learned how to like navigate conversations. But I think that would maybe mirror acceptance a little bit more, where tolerance is like, there's a kid in my class and he drives me crazy, but it is just better for the class if we don't fight. You know what I'm saying? Like, maybe that's the distinction, is that relationship status, but again, these are why I want to leave you with those questions, because these are personal. This is self-reckoning time. When we ask these questions, this is where we start to be honest with ourselves. We all have different thresholds. We all have different ability to kind of copacetically get along with people. We have different ability to receive people. And the point is not for me to tell you what your threshold is, but for you to find it for yourself. And it can be day to day. Today, I don't have it in me to deal with strong political views from opposing sides, and just go ahead.
Lauren, will you send us those questions?
Yeah, I was
If I could-
actually when Cynthia added one and then Marty added one, I will definitely add them in. I'm actually going to just quickly add into this document. I'm adding in these questions that were just asked. Okay. And then later I'll email them to you, okay? So real quick, it just seems natural to then move into that sibling language, the brothers and sisters. So yes, religions do things well and also do things poorly. And oftentimes, most religions have a social justice aspect, okay? A lot of religions have a meditation and quietness practice. A lot of religions have a mystical value, okay? And in those overlaps, we tend to see our siblinghood, okay? Rituals also function in this way because we may see some overlap with Judaism and Islam, but we may also see some very big distinctions, right? For instance, we celebrate a Eucharist. Okay, it is different than a Passover meal. It's a specific story revolving around a very specific event that we celebrate, right? So we start to see where we're very different individuals in relationship to people who are very similar to us as if they're brothers and sisters. So yeah, like our rituals have a hard time transcending boundaries. Okay, we can't necessarily shove things, and this is why we don't want to do something like adopt a Passover Seder into our Maundy Thursday. That's appropriation because it's not technically part. Our story goes to the table here, and I'm pointing at it. If you can see me on the Church of the Nativity screen, pointing at it. But when we start taking, well, we're going to perform this and we're going to celebrate it, it's kind of taking a tradition from another religion and not necessarily respecting it as theirs, which is what we aim to do when we do that, but we're appropriating it into our Easter celebration. And it's an interesting thing because a lot of Jewish people don't like it when Christians celebrate a Seder, especially during Holy Week. They find it very offensive. So rituals don't often transcend boundaries. This is in where we start to see we're not so alike. We start to see the bottom part of that quotation from Nasser in regards to the distinctions. But even within Christianity, we could even look at how not all Christians think the same thing. That's why we have denominations, right? We could get into heated fights around this table about what's going on there, specifically because we don't all think the same. We all have different views, and it's wonderful. I love the denominations in Christianity because it means you can find a home for where you are, for what you believe. And then you can even switch that home. Sometimes we get into this hardcore, like, I'm going to be an Episcopalian cradle to grave. You don't have to be. And even as you go about, even if you are, that Episcopalianism can change. It can shift. It could, when we allow our pre-understandings to get rattled a little bit, okay? So that's what I love about the Episcopal Communion, is that it is broad and wide, and all of us can come with our varying views of what's going on Sunday morning when I do you all have your different views. They are all nuanced differently, and yet we can still partake of one meal. And I love that. I love how big and broad the Episcopal Communion is. And then we have, like differences in regards to there's deities in some religions and not deities in others. And so we start to see all these distinctions, okay? One thing that I really like about all religions, and I'm going to give you a break before, like right after I say this, is the idea of stories. It's been something that I've been fascinated with, but every religion has stories. And one of the favorite stories I've encountered recently, and I'll mention this maybe later, but the idea, I read this for Indigenous Peoples Day. I read the Ute legend of how things were created by Poco the Old Man. And I love that there is the idea that Poco the Old Man formed humanity out of the dirt. Because I have a similar story. And it's so profound to me that two different traditions can have this earth mentality about where humanity came from. We're not as different as we like to claim, but we're not as similar as we also like to believe. And our stories kind of get at the nuances without it being something caustic or toxic. Right? We can compare stories. My favorite part of Poco and the Old Man, and then I'll give you a break after this, is where in so many places the sun is revered as this amazing thing, but according to the Ute legend of Poco and the Old Man, the sun is bad. The moon is good. The sun has arrows as trying to kill everything. And I'm like, preach. Right? Like you walk around in this desert territory and there are times where I'm just like, why are you so bright? Why are you trying to shrivel me up like as soon as I go and get the mail? Anyway, I thought it was a profound statement because so many other traditions kind of elevate the sun as something magnificent. And Poco and the Old Man tells us that the sun is bad. It's got arrows and it's aiming for everyone and it's trying to kill things. I just thought that was like so perfect to the environment. Anyway, when we come back from a little break, we're going to get into more of these stories because they're so fascinating. And I think we can start to see where we're related in story and different in story, rather than trying to compare dogma and practice. And I would like to see Christians actually embrace more of their mythological side. We need our storytellers back. So with that, go ahead, take a break, come back to me in about 5 minutes. So that's 7:32. I'll be here. All right, so get used to it. I'm gonna drink water because I'm thirsty. All right, we'll keep waiting a little bit, but I will jump in just sort of talking about how stories begin to kind of allow us to see the brilliance and beauty of our overlap and distinction between other traditions, and really could be a ground for creating amicable discussion, you know, comparing our stories. Stories in religious traditions address how life began and try to understand why there's death, and they are both oral and written. We're a tradition that's principally written, if you think about it. Okay, we depend on the oral history of Israel, but Christianity is written. Our New Testament has scrolls and letters. We use stories to address techniques and devotion and ecstasy. We use stories to talk about our institutions, our sacred places, and our sacred times. We use story to talk about human activity in the world. We use story to profess belief about God or gods or the supernatural. We use stories to talk about things and people being holy, the ta hagia, tois hagios, the holy gifts for holy people. And religion is profoundly dependent on story. Think about a Sunday service at your basic church. The whole entire thing, even the sermon to some degree, is a retelling of a story. From the moment Christian clergy process in, we're telling a story. We sing a story. We read a story. I explain a story. I then perform a story. And then I send you on your way into your own story. Okay, it starts to disarm things when we think about religions participating in stories and telling these wonderful stories. Okay, so I just want to start before we get into some other, and I'm going to switch over here to my teaching outline rather than my teaching lecture. And I wrote down a bunch of different stories from different traditions that I could remember. I'm sorry, I'm not super researched, but my memory tends to be pretty good about some of these things. But I wanted to look at different stories from different traditions that I find fascinating. And I would love it if anyone has a story that they know of that they have engaged with, you can share it as well. So one of the stories that I like is the story of Buddha's transcendent birth. Has anyone familiar with Buddhism and the story of how the Buddha was born? Okay, it's fascinating because when I teach this to students, like high school students, they all giggle because it's so silly until I do one thing, and I'll wait for that moment. So the story goes, and again, I'm doing this from memory. I also had to walk here, so I couldn't bring all my texts. Anyway, the story goes that Buddha's mother, whom was married, they were royal. So Siddhartha Gautama, actually a real person, was very, very wealthy. But his birth was very, very magical. And mom had a dream, the princess, the queen, had a dream of this white elephant, and it was majestic in form, and she woke up and she realized she was pregnant. And then when the time came for the baby to be born, Buddha was born out the side. Okay, and this is the story of how Buddha was born into the world. We have a woman who had a dream, and we have a sort of very special, not really sure if the dream of the elephant is also how the woman becomes pregnant, but there's a correlation between having dreamt this thing and then waking up and finding oneself pregnant. And then when it's time, the birth is not like other human births, it's out the side, okay? Out the side of the stomach. Now, none of you are giggling like my students did because they thought it was so crazy that she would have a dream about a white elephant, find herself pregnant, and then baby would be born out the side. And I was like, wait a second, let's go talk about Mary. Right? Just one moment before we start laughing at other tradition stories of the inception of the person that is the influence and the inspiration. We need to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves, because we've got some interesting things, but we believe it to be true. No, Mary was visited by the Holy Spirit, and then the Holy Spirit came upon her, and then she was pregnant, and it is something that we believe very firmly. But that thing over there about Buddha, that's comical. And it's all about where we're kind of placing that ultimate concern. Is the ultimate concern about this story being factual and that one being false? Or is it about something else, right? You can sort of see when we start to see that tension between these two conception narratives, we start to see that there's a lot of similarities, and yet both are trying to ascribe a certain divinity, a certain status to the perspective individuals. Buddha was really unique. And so the stories that formed around Buddha became very unique to separate these stories of the separating out someone's birth, that it wasn't like anything else, removes them a little bit from that human predicament. They're not like you and me. Now, Jesus' story is different, right? So when we look at Luke, we get a different story where the angel proclaims that Mary will conceive. And she says, let it be done to me. And that's actually really interesting in the Latin. If you ever wanted to study it, I'm game. But anyway, when she says that, then the Holy Spirit comes upon her. So there's a clear moment of conception. And then she has conceived Jesus. And then we go into the whole where Joseph has his external crisis and doesn't know what to do. And the angel visits him. And, Luke works this out very well. But it's a story that we don't have documentation in regards to this thing being factual, but we are so scared as Christians to allow some ambiguity to make its way in, because what happens if Jesus wasn't conceived by the Holy Spirit? Was God on the cross, dying for us, getting rid of the sacrificial system for some people, or did Jesus do anything with sin on the cross and resurrection? Like, how do we account for Jesus, our claim that Jesus is fully divine and fully human? Right? It's a really fascinating thing to think about, because the stories can function in so many different ways for so many different people. Okay. Hinduism has a fun origination story. The caste system. Anyone know how the caste system came into play? No, it's always been around. There's two theories in Hinduism. One is someone looked around and realized that people were generally in categories and then just kind of structured something around it. Another one, which I find is way more fun, is primordial Purusha. And primordial Purusha is a primordial man that dies and his body is divided up and his his head becomes the sages, that Brahmin level, and his arms become the warrior caste, and his legs become the merchant class, and the feet become the servant class. Okay, we have stories to make sense of our environment. All right, what Christian stories do we have that are similar in form to Purusha, the primordial man, but that are aimed at making sense of our world?
Glossolalia.
Oh, tongues, yeah. Yeah, speaking in different languages. Do you mean like the charismatic, like I'm going to speak in tongues?
Well, and I mean like this, like Pentecost.
Yeah.
And
Yes, yeah, the movement of the Spirit, absolutely, that's another way. And that reminded me of that we have a strong belief in that God gives each person certain gifts, and then we function within those gifts. And Paul makes a big deal of this in his letter. Some are made to be teachers and some are made to be, forming a story around something that's already structured. And that's the same one where we get, and some speak in tongues and some translate. That's that same passage. That's what made me think of it, Cynthia. Anything else from a Christian perspective that allows us to make sense of things that are?
I may be mistaken, but exorcism.
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't the Christian faith speak to that in some religions, some branches of churches? I may be wrong, but I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, yes. Okay, so that is an interesting one. I'm not really, apart from Rosemary's Baby, right? Or watching Supernatural, the show, which I'm not really sure how it's on season 20 or whatever it is. But anyway, there is an active storyline in Christianity of being possessed by demons and then needing to be exorcised. And oftentimes, historically, demons were used to explain people who struggle with mental health. Demons were used to explain how someone could be different from the rest of society. Criminal activity could also be. Women, we got into the witches if we danced or laughed wrong or right, there was that, if a woman was acting outside of what was prescribed to her, a storyline, a mythology would be applied to her that she was now being kind of persuaded by witchery. So yeah, that whole black magic realm has a strong line within Christianity. And in fact, one of the principal people that assists us with finding Protestantism, Martin Luther, was scared to death of the devil. He had a vivid relationship with the devil, vivid. And that comes through his medieval influence, and his mother gave it to him because his mother had a very strong fear of hell and the devil. Again, another mythology trying to make sense of what happens after this life, right? We like to categorize people, you do something bad, you're on team Satan. You do something good, you're on team Jesus. We like to categorize people and then put them in according to a story. Anything else?
I'm thinking of like Revelation and
Yeah.
post-trib and pre-trib and all of that.
Yes, excellent, excellent. That's a really great Left Behind series. Who here read it? Most of it. I didn't get to Glorious Reappearing. I had hit seminary at that point and I realized, I don't know if any of this is right. Anyway, yes, we have a whole storyline of built out of Revelation.
Don't you think that one of the purposes of religion is to help us make sense of our environment?
Yeah, and that's why we use stories. Absolutely. Absolutely. It gives us a framework. And the thing that we need to realize is that I read a lot of theology that assumes that the Christian framework is the only right framework. But yeah, and that's the thing, is that we need to wrestle with our religion and its stories, and we need to maybe work to demythologize. So that means realizing that these stories aren't science facts or historical accounts always, but that they're stories. So when we do the process of demythology, we look at these things frankly, but it doesn't mean we need to throw them out unless they're causing too much damage and they're not participating in bringing the love of God further into the world. And sometimes we have to let some stories go. Christians have a hard time with letting some of their stories go because they've been built into our dogma very, very strongly. But you're right. Religions tell stories to make sense of the world. All of them do it. All of them. Yes, Marty.
I think part of the problem, and I'm not going to limit this to Christians, is we look at those stories as humans, we look at those stories and they're told and retold over generation to generation, and they become fact. And then we can't challenge them. And if we're honest and look at the Bible, it is the Hebrew Testament is self-contradictory in many ways. So is the the Christian Testament.
Mm-hmm.
What we have to look at is the heart of the story. What is that, the message that's trying to come through from that story?
Yes, 100%, 100%. And I do want to say that not all traditions actually allow their stories to become facts. But I do think that there is a tendency for that to happen, especially in our more Western mindset. We like things to be very clear cut. This is
And
true.
it happened more after the printing press came out.
Yes, exactly. Because now we didn't have to. Stories, when they're passed on orally, allow for flexibility. Okay. But yeah, so that's a really great point, Marty. I'm glad you brought that up. You know, like when we talk about Judaism and we talk about the First Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, specifically the Pentateuch or the Torah, the first 5 books of that Hebrew Testament, we look at Genesis 1 and 2, and I know I bump into a lot of people who say, well, God said this in Genesis 1 and then said this in Genesis 2, where historically those oral traditions had a little bit more flexibility. And if you actually go back and compare manuscripts of the same story, you'll see text change because people are trying to make sense of it in their current culture. But now that we have printing presses, which are brilliant, we now can just reproduce something as it is without scribal additions. Okay. So yeah, that's, we have to look at, when we look at Genesis 1 and 2, we look at it for the point. It's not a science textbook, but if we take our scientific, enlightenment brain and put it onto Genesis 1 and demand it to be a text about how the world was actually created, we actually do a disservice to the text. We're abusing it because it's ceasing to be what it is, a story that was passed on orally for a long time before it was written down, and we force it to be in a whole different genre than it is. It's a story. It's not a science textbook, but it is a profound story, and it's brilliant. Go ahead, Marty.
We also have to remember, as Christians and looking at the Christian scriptures, we have made, particularly the nativity narratives, we have made, in many ways, your soup blend of the nativity. Which stories, which elements of the nativity stories come from which gospel writer, and why is he using those?
And only
Because
one.
they're trying to make points to different audiences.
Yeah, and
So
it's
they're
only
not all
one.
in all the stories. John doesn't even have a nativity narrative.
Neither does Matthew, neither does Mark. Just Luke.
Yep.
We literally are dependent on Luke for that whole dialogue about Jesus and John and Elizabeth and Mary. Matthew opens up with a genealogy.
And goes back to the whole thing about having to go to Bethlehem and so on.
Yeah, there's no real discussion about like the actual, you get to sort of like where Jesus is born. But Luke is the only one that has this very extensive story, and he's got a mission. That
And
story.
technically, well, traditionally, he was physician to Mary, so he got the stories from her. We don't know that.
Yeah, except for the dating of the story, which is 80, which would have made Luke like 100. But
Exactly. That's my point.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Gospels
We
weren't
spilled a
even
lot of
written
blood
till
over these
The
things.
Gospels weren't even written until after Paul's first letter.
Exactly. Paul wrote in the 50s. The Gospels came three decades later in the 80s.
And not even in the order we have them.
Right, and that's exactly right. So as we are holding on to our stories lightly, I would love to bring up, since we're talking about Jesus, and we have a story about Jesus and dying and rising again, right? I'm reminded of, anyone familiar with Sikhism? It's a really interesting tradition, and it's one of the more recent religions because it comes on the scene in the 1600s. And it's in the collision of Hinduism and Islam. And you see a lot of this. You see a lot of Sikhism actually trying to make sense of the collision of these two religions in the Punjab territory of India. All right. So one of the things about the foundation of this religion is Guru Nanak, who's the founder of Sikhism, goes to his morning bath at a river, and he goes into the river and never comes back out. And his town is desperately nervous and worried for him until 3 days later he comes out. And he tells the story that as he's in the water, he is encountered by the monist spirit, like the thing that's kind of behind everything. And it gives him this phrase, the Ik Oankar, which is one universal creator. All things are one. And when he comes out, he is reborn out of what he was into this new understanding of humanity and the divine and religion. And it has the same feel as Jesus's resurrection story. And the way that the Guru Granth, the text for Sikhism, opens up sounds just like John 1. But these stories overlap, they share, they use these stories. In Islam, you have Muhammad who goes to a cave, and it's in this cave that Muhammad receives the sacred text that becomes the Quran written down. In Taoism, we have stories about the Tao and achieving immortality this side of life. Okay, and that doesn't take a big stretch to understand the desire for immortality as Christians who confess a bodily resurrection. Okay, it might seem silly to try to achieve immortality this side of death, but there's as silliness in the claim that after death we will be risen bodily. We talked about the Ute story and Poco, the old man. We've talked about Buddha's birth. We've talked about primordial Purusha. We've talked about Taoism and Tao. And then we have Confucius, and Confucius used stories all the time to teach his understandings of things and teach his students things. He would always tell stories. Who else told stories to teach?
Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. And as I've said, one of my favorite things is when I'm teaching this and someone said, when I'm teaching from a tradition and we're looking at the actual text and someone says, man, Buddha sounds just like Jesus. I'm like, yeah, because the stories are in the air. Look at the location and the context of where Jesus is. Jesus didn't just, I mean, as much as we want to respect the story that Luke gives us about the conception of Jesus being divine, Jesus is born into a context and a culture that is well behind Hinduism and Buddhism. Those things are already in the air, these ideas, you know? So stories, so all of that to say, and we're going to wrap up here because I want to leave time for any other further discussion. I think if we start looking at ourselves as really participating in a story, we may disarm some of the hackles that go up when other people want to tell us about their stories. As Marty said, like, we have factualized things that are stories. And in that way, we cease to appreciate them as stories. People stop reading the Bible when they realize it's not fact. Okay? If we allow these stories in our sacred text to be stories, then they can start to have errors. Then they can start to have missteps. And it's okay that Jesus gets the wrong high priest. It doesn't mean God doesn't exist. It just means that these stories that have been held onto and passed on had errors. When we allow stories to be stories, we get to see how they impact our personal stories. When we allow these religious stories that we listen to every Sunday actually form our worship, they will transform us because they will ask us to consider them in our context. What does it mean to read Genesis 2 in 2021 as a story? What does it mean to read about the resurrection of Jesus in all four Gospels in 2021? Stories can flex and move and bend. Facts get stuck like stones in the past. We have stories, and we start to see these religious stories that we participate in every Sunday and maybe even daily. We can start to see how our story is part of that bigger one. It's really neat. I love seeing the Bible come back alive for people. It's a beautiful story, and one that, if you let it be a story, has profound relevance for us at every time. And with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, we can ask our New Testament, or rather our Christian Testament, who is Jesus for us today? What do Jesus's stories allow us to do today? How do they challenge our pre-understanding? How can they form us without us creating rules and dogmas from them? So stories, that's what I want to end on. I want you to think about that. So with my little shorter diatribe this time over, anything else for the good of the order?
Yeah, I'd like to offer something here. It seems like the stories are really getting at what was referred to earlier on as religious truth, which is really the shared human experience all the way through humanity.
Yes.
And what we make of it.
Mm-hmm. I love that. We're storytellers. Humans love stories. If we lose the humanities, we lose our humanity. You know, to refer to Dead Poets Society. Anyone here see it with Robin Williams? At the very beginning, he talks about, he's trying to impart passion to his students. And he's like, it's great to be a doctor. It's great to be an engineer. Those are great things. But we go to war over love. We go to, we fight for someone because of poetry. Like, these are the things that make us human. And I do think that because all humans share stories, it's a really profound way of understanding our experience. I think it's really, really neat. And it does get us into maybe similar territory beyond just tolerance. Maybe. I'm going to turn everyone into an English major. That is my goal. Just kidding. We need historians too. At one point, the priest was the doctor and the storyteller and the historian.
And the scribe.
Exactly, yeah.
And we forget that too. These stories started out as oral tradition.
Yeah,
and
yes.
they passed down.
It's on.
How many of you gather at Thanksgiving and tell family stories? Or Christmas or whenever? And the third generation's hearing this story. They're hearing the third variation of this story. Because those stories don't stay the same.
Yeah.
And not only do we pass them down, but then they've been from Aramaic and Hebrew to Greek to Latin to French to German to...
Yeah, and Ralph brought that up.
Translation is not perfect.
Yeah, Ralph brought that up last time, that we don't even really know necessarily what's going on. Okay, Ralph, you've been trying to say something.
I've been on my computer, but my mic doesn't work, so I've been listening but not participating. So a great story that talks about a number of the issues we're talking about tonight has to do with medieval priests. Young man was copying text in the Bible. And so he goes to this old priest. He says, I can't discern this word. What is it? And so the old priest says, I don't know. Let me go down to the archives. 4 or 5 hours later, the young priest says, geez, where is he? And he goes down and he sees the old priest knocking his head against the wall. Bang, bang, bang. And it says, Father, 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 what's the matter? He says, it's not celibate, it's celebrate.
Oh, that's awesome. That is so funny. That is so funny. And it also hits me in a very special spot because I have been reformatting a book out of old German text, Fracter, that medieval text, into regular text. And I could not find the definition of a word. And I was like, I don't know what Aristens is. What's Aristens in German? I was searching and searching and searching and searching. And then I got really close to the text and I noticed that the thing I thought was an R had a little teeny weeny faint line on it on the bottom, and it was an X. And I had to go back to everything and do a Control F, find, replace, and change it all to existence. So, but yes, that's so funny. Like, it's just one little letter being off. But anyway, thank you for sharing that story. Anyway, it's after 8 and I don't want to keep you any longer, but enjoy your story. Go on and enjoy your stories.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
See you later.
Good night.
That was
Good
a
night.
wonderful class. Wonderful class.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Love you
That was
all.
beautiful, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thank
I'm hungry.
you.
Mm-mm.